Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for starting another week on the NSE with us. Thanks for tuning in. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 960th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and today I have the huge pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring William Corwin, Eleanor Heartney, Amanda Millet-Sorsa, Saul Ostrow, and Charlie Schultz. We are thrilled to welcome poet Samuel Breslin here to close today's program. And now to get started, I'll introduce today's guests and host. Sculptor and journalist William Corwin is from New York. He has exhibited at galleries in New York, London, Hamburg, Beijing, and Taipei. He's written regularly for many arts publications, including the Brooklyn Rail. New York-based art critic Eleanor Heartney is the author of numerous books on contemporary art. Heartney is a contributing editor for Art in America and has written extensively for many publications, including the New Art Examiner, the Washington Post, and we are so lucky to have her as an editor at large here at the Rail. Amanda Millet-Sorsa is an artist, arts writer, and arts worker based in New York. She's exhibited at Below Grand Gallery, where she's also a curator, and also she's exhibited at the Unoppressive Non-Imperialist Bargain Bookstore, Shim Art Network, the Socrates Sculpture Park, and elsewhere, and we are lucky to have her as a contributor here at the Rail. Independent curator and critic Saul Ostrow is also co-founder of Critical Practices, Inc. and has organized over 80 exhibitions, and Saul's writing has appeared in art magazines, journals, and catalogs all over the USA and Europe. And our host today is writer and editor Charlie Schultz. Charlie is managing editor here at the Rail. Thank you all so much for being here on the NSE today. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Eleanor. And thanks to everyone who's come today. I see some of the artists in the exhibition. Thank you very much for coming. I hope that you will chime in when the opportunity arises. This is a really special show, and I'm really thankful to be joined by some of my colleagues to talk about it today. The show is called Retinal Hysteria. I just wanted to hold this. Thank you. Yeah, anybody who's got one, hold it up. One of the coolest catalogs produced for a show in 2023. As you can see, riffing on the cover of the Post. Curated by a Rail, a longtime follower, friend, and supporter of the Rail, Rob Storr. And I would like to jump into the install shots to give everyone a quick visual of the expanse of this exhibition before we get into talking about the individual works. And while Eleanor gives you a short visual tour, I am going to read a snippet of Rob Storr's essay to bring his words right into this Zoom room, because Rob Storr's words are worth being repeated. Here we go. This show is devoted to how it affects vision, indeed to how the eye engenders it in traumatic conditions such as those we have been going through. Disorienting intensity has been the main criteria for selection instead of medium or manner. Stylistic affiliation has been no concern to me whatsoever. Funk, imagism, underground comics, you name it, are all just temporary labels for expressive imperatives, characteristic of retinal hysteria. I have played fast and loose with chronology since it is a recurring phenomena. We saw it aplenty in the 60s and 70s when the world appeared to be coming apart at the seams. The world is indubitably doing so again now. Whether crisis and chaos prompt hysteria in artists, or whether it is more a matter of how they trigger audience reception within the general public, this is a question for academics. I am interested in experience at its height. So welcome to rooms full to overflowing with images that vibrate with panic, uncontrollable anger, out of control laughter, orgasmic release, and the sheer vertigo of living in a state of hypersensitivity to the disparate stimuli of, quoting one of retinal hysteria's modern masters, H.C. Westerman, a world gone nuts. Thank you, Rob. for giving us such a fantastic show to visit as the year comes to an end and to discuss as we are here to do so today. As we look through the last couple images, yes, this is a beauty. This is a beauty. And if there's one more and we could just get to Rob's drawings. Thank you. Anybody who didn't get enough of the slideshow of install shots, the exhibition is open until December 23rd, 2 locations. Definitely go and see it. Want to start the discussion today with Rob Storr's drawings. Not only is Rob a phenomenal writer, a phenomenal curator, Rob Storr is also a practicing artist. And I think that the sort of boundaryless practice of Rob Storr is maybe some place to begin this idea of talking about hysteria. There are a lot of bodies in this show, and there are a lot of ways that bodies are moving, depicted, and the way bodies are meant to make you feel. This is one of the earlier works in the show. Eleanor, could we see the other? Thank you. So I just want to open up, I guess, by asking my colleagues what they think about these party animals, and if they have any response to the text of Rob's that I read to open the conversation.
Well, I'd be happy to jump in here. Yeah, I mean, Rob, Rob has, I think, throughout his career as a curator and, as we can see, as an artist, he's always been someone to kind of attack the overly constricted kind of, we could say, even puritanical tendencies of the art world, from Greenberg to Roz Krauss. There's a kind of aesthetic puritanism that he has always been there to undermine. We see that in his party animals here. And I was struck in the text that you read about the idea of kind of, I guess, in a way, the politics of this kind of work. As he says, this is a recurring theme, but we particularly feel it right now. I mean, this is such a time of instability. And I think that, to me, that was what really struck me about the work. We're at a moment when it seems like all kinds of borders are being breached, from AI and technology, sort of gender categories, even literal borders of, war fleeing refugees. So, I mean, there's this time of total instability. And then at the same time, sort of countering that, there are these tendencies now towards censorship, towards, so-called cancel culture, to police those borders. And I think that this show appears, I mean, of course, this work comes over a number of decades, but I think that the work here really shows us, I guess, a counter to those kind of censorious and very puritanical tendencies, and those tendencies to sort of police what we can say, what we can do, and what we can think.
Will, what do you think about that idea of instability as a driver for aesthetics, and as Joyce's picture comes on screen? Perhaps you could give us a few words about Joyce.
Oh, okay. What I found, I mean, to talk about Joyce is kind of not. She struck me as one of. There were several strands of thought going through the show that Rob so wonderfully put together. I mean, Joyce as a kind of disruptor of what we feel are sort of treasured images like Mickey Mouse and Homer Simpson, and then sort of twisting them around and making them very dark and exposing the side of human nature that those icons kind of gloss over was sort of what Joyce's, I think, what a lot of her maybe not intentional motivation, but what she managed to do with her work. And this is sort of one of her really creepy Mickey Mouses, which kind of they dissolve into the glossy black and gold enamel that she used, and had this very sticky surface that was not the clean, neat lines of Disney or Hanna-Barbera or well, The Simpsons obviously has its own sense of sarcasm and satire. But what I thought was really interesting about this exhibition was the idea of hysteria, and then that combined with the idea of satire. And as in our panel discussion prep, we were asked to think about several of the artists. And the artists that I really thought about, which I think it lends itself to one aspect of Rob's approach to this idea of retinal hysteria, were several of the more satirical artists. And this idea of satire being a kind of proto-form aligned with allegory, and the idea of the satirist who takes recognizable symbols and objects and creates a kind of almost hallucinogenic quality with them. I was thinking specifically of Mark Thomas Gibson, who's in this show, and Jamie and Giuliano Villani, and Art Spiegelman, using these very recognizable figures and symbols and creating these allegorical compositions, which, you know, while not always being hysterical in so that they are sort of traumatic or disruptive to look at when we think of traditional allegory, it is a way of putting together all of these sort of odd objects that don't usually come together and creating this kind of confusion and chaos, which has a political solution, right? It's sort of a rebus where it explains a kind of political situation, especially with Gibson's work of what's going on right now, but also presents, you know, a hysterical vision, which is just a confusing mass of objects, which makes sense theoretically, but not necessarily in a realistic, naturalistic framework. So that was the aspect of retinal hysteria that really jumped out at me, was Rob's collection of cartoonists, of political artists who have this freedom to just collect symbols, put them together, create allegory, create satire, which doesn't necessarily function, you know, as a naturalistic image, but is this kind of comedic, chaotic imagery. So that was what I really pulled from it. And Joyce does that on a sort of individual scale with her images of Mickey Mouse and Homer Simpson and various characters, which are already satires or, you know, mascots or sort of accumulations of ideas that have been rendered into a simple image. And then she sort of tears those apart. I was more excited not more excited, but I was very interested by the political side and the satire that Rob pulled into the show, which I think is an intrinsic part of retinal hysteria.
I agree with that. And I would, Eleanor, do you mind jumping to the R. Crumb drawing that's at the end of the slideshow? I think that this drawing by R. Crumb, who's an artist that Rob put a number of his works into the show, and is an artist who is on the outskirts of the art world, although extremely prominent in the illustration and dark comics. This really struck me because, I mean, fear of the invisible, we've got our COVID virus, which was not a visual meme I don't think any of us had on our radar until 2020. But the COVID virus in some ways functions like the original Mickey, and like we know that there's a referent. And just as Joyce took that referent and gave it a satirical twist that brings all sorts of dark energies forward, I think that this is a very similar type of handling where something dark is given a treatment with humor and satire to come into a different place. I think it's also good to recognize, to have this on screen, to, you know, make one more point about Rob Storr's great curation. And you know, he said very clearly that one of the primary driving forces of this show was the energy that he felt during COVID, during Trump presidency, a sense of cabin fever, a sense of the walls getting tight and him wanting to burst the walls apart. This also brings up the idea of fear, fear of the invisible. And I guess Saul, I want to bring you and Amanda into the conversation. I'm going to prompt you with a question that neither one of you put on the sheet, which is, do you think that fear and hysteria have a relationship? And if so, do you think it's a necessary one? Or how do you think about that relationship?
I think fear and hysteria are constantly with us. It's an existential condition. What interests me about this show is it's a sort of index of the acceptable grotesque. That it's the irony of the show is it ends up, given this conversation, in a funny way, comforting. It's not upsetting. As you pointed out, some of these artists have been working for decades, back to the 60s and things like that. I can push this all the way back to the 1890s, and probably even earlier to somebody like Goya. That it's a state of affairs that's always just behind the screen of stability, security, and so on. And every once in a while, we end up in a situation in which it bubbles to the surface, and we take comfort in that we're not alone in our fears.
Yeah, I think the humor is such an important element in that too. It's a way to face those fears, because we all have these fears of everything falling apart.
Yep, they told jokes in Auschwitz.
But I also think that there's something about this show that made me think more about what does hysteria mean as this heightened state of emotion that, Rob Storr was perhaps feeling in the state of cabin fever, of bursting out. And I think that hysteria, if we look at it, from what we understand of it throughout history, as the neurological disorder, is that it's always kind of on the cusp of this heightened emotion. You never know when it's going to come. And that's kind of also, it can be attributed to fear. And so it's like you're constantly moving from one state of heightened emotion, but then back again to this more recognizable state as we understand it from patients who develop these symptoms. And so, so I think the way for me to enter this show was really through the Louise Bourgeois, where you see the triptych of the red room that accompanied the bigger room of the cells. Because you really get to understand, well, what is it that the body is going through in these moments of hysteria, as she based these lithographs, these images, from studying and looking and being inspired from photographs taken by the French neurologist Charcot in the 19th century. And here you can see that the body is constantly in the state of trying to fall down. It cannot stand up on its own when it is in these states of heightened emotion. And here we can really kind of see that, and then we can, see in that third image how that arch of hysteria then became a more known work of hers in sculpture. And you see this body constantly being pulled to the ground rather than uplifted. And sometimes in fear, we can kind of defend ourselves or, come forward in order to overcome. And yet it feels like in these moments of hysteria, one completely loses control. You don't know actually how to overcome it, whether, it's triggered by a trauma that we feel in the grander scale of society, as Eleanor was pointing out.
Yeah, one thing I think is very interesting run throughout the show is this body, the notion of the body, and the body sort of losing control of the body, because maybe that's our ultimate sort of standard of stability, is our own body, the sense of the coherence of our own body. And yet these bodies are all mutating, and they're, turning into other things. And it struck me too that, again, because I'm looking at it through a kind of political lens, I guess, of our current, political traumas and crises, that the body is so central to so many of the crises we're facing right now. Of course, not just sort of, Roe v. Wade and the whole reproductive freedom thing, but then there's the, kind of the issue of sort of gender and sexual identity, and that the kind of the blurring of the lines there. that, that this idea of bodies, I think, are, and the idea of sexuality. A lot of the works sort of verge on porn. They play with porn, and porn is also a kind of reminder of sort of sexuality and the body as a kind of disruptive force. And of course, there's the whole kind of AI technology thing, and the way in which we've all become so immersed in the internet, and we sort of lose sense of our body. So I think it's a bringing us back to that, and also kind of bringing us back to that sense of sort of this dissolution of that order through the body as the kind of the ultimate, maybe, marker of our current instabilities.
Right, and I really liked the portrait that Maria Lasnig did of the prosthetic arm. And I feel like that kind of also, takes us very literally into the body. We have this human body and we have this non-human part of the body. And yet it's the robotic or man-made part, the prosthetic, that is reaching out to us. And here we can see, hysteria, these heightened state of emotions, if we think of, very saturated and vibrant colors and brushwork. And yet it's that left hand there that's kind of touching in this painterly space. We don't quite know what it's touching about, but I think it's kind of pointing to also, in these moments of instability, well, is it that human touch that brings us back to humanity? That can kind of bring us back to the state of, emotions that we can, heal and take care of ourselves, or can kind of manage a lot better than things that we cannot.
I think an interesting thing about this painting that also struck me with a lot of the works in the show was I remember Rob talking about these paintings being for the eye, and of course the exhibition's title has retina right in it. And so I went around looking at how eyes were represented in the various works that Rob chose. There's not many where there's just not eyes, or the eyes are willfully shut, as in this one. That really leads me to think about, the difference between what we take for granted with our vision, what knowledge we carry with us in our bodies. And when I think about, Eleanor, if you wouldn't mind putting Dana Schutz's piece back up relative to this one, the hand-eye relationship is so prominent. And I don't know where this goes, but it's a thing that I notice, and I noticed it a lot in the Art Crumb drawings too. Eyes are coming out in Solly Sal's sculpture. The eyeballs are held in the hands of the character. And so let me put that into a question just to vision. And Will, I'll pass it back to you since we haven't heard from you for a moment.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, well, this is what Rob talked about it is at sort of the introductory opening event, was the idea of the grotesque and the idea of our sense of aesthetics and messing with the body. And it's not necessarily about beauty versus ugliness, right? It's about alternate ideas. And so there's both this kind of, in almost all of the works, there is this desire to distort the body or transform the body and remove the eyes or stretch the face, or to kind of have these sort of off-color obscene, like what could be called obscene jokes. And then the idea of the eye looking back at you, which is, a reference or a trigger for the observer, I think is also, you're looking at the picture and you're looking at yourself, and there's a mirroring here. When the picture looks at you and you look back at it, there's that idea of the connectedness between the portrait and the viewer. So, it's this idea that this is you, the Maria Lasnik portrait holding her eye in her prosthetic hand, kind of gazing at you, is, I think with Lasnik, especially with the sort of post-war Austrian concept that she's working with, is this idea of, you are part of this collective responsibility for what is happening in the world. So I think the eyes are that kind of bond between the viewer in that regard. But also this idea of distortion, which Rob talked about, this idea of alternative ideas of beauty or ugliness or whatever you want to call it, coming up, and these figures that are being torn apart or bent or melted, especially with like the Peter Saul paintings, and again back to Joyce and the kind of melting mouse. and the R. Crumb images, which are always so, there's that one that's on the back cover where I can't remember where it is, but it's the guy looking in the mirror saying, wait, is that me? And then he says, yeah, that is me. I'm, I am that ugly or distorted or creepy. Yeah. What is it? Self-loathing, which is a great one. Yeah. So again, it's looking and mirroring and
well, in actuality, given the vast majority of these figures that they don't look, they don't focus, then it's the possibility of the critique of a critique built into there of the viewer who doesn't see either or seeks to impose order on chaos throughout that we're not seeing. If there's the possibility, this is a perfect example of it. The Ed Paschke, in which there's a certain seductiveness here, but ultimately there's no return gaze. And I can't think of any of the works in the show in which our gaze is returned.
Mm.
Everybody's eyes, where there are eyes, are distorted, closed, smashed, or monarchical, as in the Dana Schutz.
Mm.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's this whole, it's also, I think, the idea of chaos, it's that it becomes, and formlessness. I mean, that you can't make out often the distinctions between different parts, different characters, if there are characters. I mean, one of my favorite works in the show is the Jim Shaw piece, if we can come to that, which to me kind of is I think that Rob talked again at the opening event about how one of the inspirations here was being there in COVID in the middle of the Trump era. And, sort of this, I feel like this is what Trump has done to our heads.
Yes.
It's just this, he has sort of unleashed this chaos. And I guess one of the questions maybe that the show asks, and the show I feel like asks a lot of questions and refuses to kind of easily answer them, but is this kind of question of is chaos good or bad? I mean, in some ways chaos is disruptive, and chaos, is a way of breaking down, kind of stultifying orders. But on the other hand, chaos can lead to this as well. And so, there's this kind of tension I think in a lot of the work about, kind of how do we feel about this sort of chaos?
That's a great question. And chaos, I think, also connects to speed. When I look at this image, I really see quickness. And when I think of instability and when I think of chaos, these are all things that I align with fast-paced movement. I think about the show, and there are some examples of pretty careful, slow work in the exhibition. The Mark Greenwald piece that I singled out, if we could skip there real quick, Eleanor, I would like to show that off as an example of, yeah, thanks. And maybe can you even zoom in a little, because this is such a hyper detailed, I mean, this is a slow painting. But there's a sense of speed, I would say, in the faces, and going back to our discussion about eyes, and where the stability and instability come together in this painting for me, is really in Mark's treatment of these children's faces. The whole thing becomes unstable the closer you get to it, and the more time you spend with it, which is a little bit, I don't know, maybe a little bit backwards from what I would expect, because it's usually the chaos in the instant that is so unnerving, and the slowness and the stillness of careful observation often can undo that. But in this case, I think it's just exactly reversed.
Well,
what do you all think about speed as a phenomenon of chaos and instability as an aesthetic quality or criterion for these things?
Well, I think, yeah, you're right. Some of the works seem slow. Some of the works seem, I mean, I'm thinking about the Carol Walker, which is totally, explosive. And it's a kind of,
Explosive.
yeah, anti creation myth in a way. I mean, it, kind of made me think of, kind of Michelangelo's, creation gone mad. I mean, here, you feel like, the world is being created through a fart or something. And, yeah, and in this case, it is about that sort of explosive speed. But yeah, I mean, there's chaos also can be in something that's much slower. I don't know if did we put any Jim Nutt pieces in the slideshow? I'm not sure if we did, but I mean, he's an artist whose work is, I mean, it's so pristine and precise. And yet it's also about this breakdown of form, breakdown of categories. So speed, I guess there's different kinds of speed in a way.
Well, I think also it's about a lot of these works. It's funny because sometimes painting speed takes a lot more time than painting sort of a simple staid image. But I think part of it is also not following what is the expected order of things, and that being a trigger of hysteria and chaos, right? And that, I think, is like a historical reading of this idea of a hysterical time or a chaotic time is when the normal procedures break down, which is kind of exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about politics of the, of 2016 to 2020, or COVID or things like that, is that the procedures weren't followed or that we couldn't follow them, and that things start to break down. I think a lot of these images are depicting collapse of things, and quick things that happen at a very quick pace but aren't thought out very carefully. And so it's also the depiction of in grotesqueness, but also of of this, like, I'm trying to remember which Dutch painter I'm thinking of, but depiction of like stupidity and mistakes and grotesqueness and foolishness, which are very popular. And there are a lot of these images that have that. I'm trying to call to mind, but obviously like the Peter Saul images, things like that, where people are doing things that are, foolish. He's pulling the whatever these are, the gold pieces out from under, so that there's a collapse going on, and he's getting kicked in the face, and then he's bemoaning to himself how hard it is. So there is this kind of depiction of stupidity and foolishness and not thinking things through, which is a very important part of chaotic historical times, when everything sort of starts to snowball and things fall apart. So I think that's it. So that's the part of the speed, is the speed of stupidity, as opposed to the time that it takes to actually formulate ideas and think them through and proceed accordingly. And I think that's a big part of Rob's, this depiction of chaos and hysteria.
And I think that the speed for me, I'll relate it back to the body, because I have this image of, when I think of hysteria and the body, of just something, like an uncontrollable laughter or anger. And these movements, these jerky movements of the body that just are very fast, that are, again, in this kind of uncontrollable state. And I think that, if we think of something that might be slow, but still has this like tension of hysteria within it, we can think of the Joyce Pensado smile that we saw earlier. Hysteria has kind of this associative, permanent, static smile that here we can maybe associate with this American positivity, that stems from this fantasy of Disneyland. And so when is that smile going to drip like this paint does? When is it going to frown? And it never does. And so there's this internal tension, which is, I think, as violent and speedy or fast as perhaps the bodies in Kara Walker's piece, where you really see the violence physically.
That's a great point, Amanda. I really like the kind of psychological speed that you described in Joyce's piece, and how it works almost in reverse. When we had Joyce and Kara side by side, it occurred to me also the incredible range of scale that Rob has brought to bear in this exhibition, and how often intimate works are overwhelmed by massive objects. And I don't think that happens here. I don't think so. And I think part of the reason is because the artworks have an equal kind of temperature to them, whether they're large, small, a drawing or a sculpture. There's a tone that keeps them all vibrating in a similar state. And I wonder if all of you felt similar or differently about the just the choices of scale in the exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that, seemingly the strategy, we have to remember it's in two different galleries, and the scale is divided by those two different galleries, and that the larger works are in one gallery, and the smaller works are in the other. That there's a real strategy in terms of the smaller works requiring a certain intimacy, that they draw you in, and the large works sort of push you back. So there's this sort of back and forth between the two galleries, and between the two, what seem to be two very different thematic approaches between the two galleries.
The smaller works, especially the art crumbs, also had a lot of text. And if you're going to really give them your time, I would say that it took more time to pay attention to the smaller works.
But you know,
just
once again, as you point out, in terms of Mark's works, those are small paintings. You have to get, if you want to see what's happening in them and how, and if you want to know anything about them, you have to get close to them, because if you step back, you almost you can't see what's going on.
But a lot of the bigger works are quite graphic. By that I mean they are quite illustrative. I mean, they have drawn realistic imagery. So that's part of Rob's kind of rejection of the Greenbergian idea of like the big painting as pure visceral experience versus intellectual, investigative, purposeful looking. And I think you can say that the smaller works, because they very often are in the tradition of caricature or cartoon or illustration, are more conspiratorial. You have to go in and look at them, and then traditionally they are, from a kind of a genre that isn't a book that you kind of distribute rather than show in a gallery. That there is this whole different, there are multiple ways of looking at these works. So whereas you might look at Joyce's piece, from afar, and you can kind of get it, you don't have to necessarily go up close. Other works like Kara Walker, it is a drawing and there is a narrative, and so you do need to kind of sit there and look at it almost as if it's a text, to get the idea that it is this like transferred fart that becomes a generative moment that creates life. There are 4 characters before that are doing things that are kind of inscrutable, but on the other hand, that there's this thing happening from each of them that ends in this kind of chaotic creation or destruction. It's hard to tell whether the fart is bringing the world into existence or destroying it. And the same is true of a lot of the other larger works, like the Danish Schutz isn't that big, I don't think, but they do have a graphic quality that requires you try to figure out the narrative by looking and investigating, as opposed to kind of the Greenbergian reception of the emotion that just flows from the canvas.
But I mean, I think what's interesting, on the other hand, it's also, although there's narratives in a lot of these works, but there's such open-ended narratives, as you were mentioning about Carol Walker. And I think that's important also in terms of this work, that, and using, even the graphic novel tradition, which is a narrative, but kind of, breaking that open, and so that it is open-ended. And one of the things that I think is what really struck me about the show is that, what one tends to see a lot of shows now, which have a kind of, I guess, I don't know, an ideological point, and you go and, the works kind of illustrate this idea. And what's kind of wonderful here is that you can't do that, yes, there are these narratives, and there's definitely these, you feel these connections between these, but you can't say, what is the point here? Or what are the many points here and I guess that goes back to the retinal notion here, is that they have to be experienced retinally. I think, there is a lot of work today that could be sort of summed up, in a sentence, that it's a kind of illustration of a idea that you can, say, but this work isn't like that. And both the show as a whole and the individual pieces are, they kind of defy narrative at the same time that they kind of tease you with it.
I really like that. I really like that line of thought, Eleanor. And you've got me thinking about something that Rob wrote that I read, which is that he was really thinking about experience when he put together this show. And that, he wants to leave the rest to academics to sort out, but that he was interested in creating a phenomenon that we could experience with our bodies, which is only a thing that we can do when we get ourselves in the room. It was remarkable to me. I mean, one of the things that Rob's great at is there's no didactic pieces here. And what's cool about putting together so many different types of works that suit this theme but don't have any obvious or clear message is that they can mean and say different things as you move through them differently. And for example, Eleanor, if you wouldn't mind pulling back up that installation shot of the Kara Walker, because as the Kara Walker was on and we were talking about, there's a narrative, and our inclination as critical observers is to try and unearth that narrative as best we can. I really liked how this Woody Diothello was right in front of such a prominent narrative piece. And the Woody is, it is antithetical to this idea of narrative. I'm not even sure what the front of the sculpture is, or if the sculpture has an intended front side. That sort of slipperiness I felt was accentuated or elevated by Rob's installation decisions. I wonder if any of the rest of you had moments where you felt the works were having an effect on one another, or if they were doing something different just based on the company that they were in.
Well, I think, one thing that struck me, I guess sort of speaks to this, is that a lot of the works come from sort of different, I guess, clusters in a way. Like there's, a number of artists who come from, the Chicago Harry Hu tradition, or, then there are artists that sort of, kind of, I don't know what you would call it, kind of the Jim Shaw, Mike Kelly, California kind of weird, kind of obscene surrealism, and you have these like different, kind of, I guess, things that have been seen as movements that are separate, but then you put them all together and you begin to see that, in fact, they really do speak to each other about, on a kind of much more subliminal, level, about this sense of, I guess, what the world is or what the world isn't.
That's a key point. And so that reminds me of something that you pointed out, which was that there's multiple generations being exhibited here. Most of the work is recent. What do you make of the fact that there's multiple generations working here, and that they're all, at least in Rob's selection, the work is vibrating on this similar unstable retinal hysterical sensibility?
Multiple generations points out to the fact that some people are living longer. When we were asked what we'd like to talk about, the idea that this is not a now moment, that this is a tradition. It's a tradition that at least reaches back to the Romantics, as I said, with Goya, and that it's runs through our culture. This type of work is always being made. It's constantly being made. It doesn't necessarily get organized and put forth except in these moments of what seem to be crisis. because we don't, to a great extent, we don't want to be reminded of these things. As I said earlier, the notion of existential fear. We'd much rather have, let's say, back to something more intellectual, something more immediate, something easier to consume. And then what happens is, the bubble bursts and this stuff comes back to the surface, and and we're all, oh my God, where has this all been for so long? And the answer is, it's always been there. Nobody was looking.
Yeah, I mean, you think about, as you say, it goes way back. You think there are these moments where, all of a sudden we see a lot of this work. Like right now, I mean, there was a whole period, particularly again, going back to the Greenberg era, or, the, kind of deconstructive era, where surrealism was seen as this very retardataire, kind of reactionary thing. And now, surrealism seems to be really in the forefront. I mean, the last Venice Biennale, very much, was kind of highlighting surrealism, both historically and contemporary. So, yeah, it's like it's not so much that the work isn't happening, but that the spotlight shifts. And
Exactly.
I think, when the spotlight shifts to this sort of, kind of chaotic, disordered, kind of anti, conventional work, it's because it is a response. I think it's to larger conditions, and certainly right now, that the COVID, Trump, and up into the current moment is one that we are all sort of struggling with, and somehow, this work speaks to us in a particular way now.
Yes. Being a child of the 60s, somehow, not the COVID, but the Trump thing, I've long seen coming, and this reminds us back to, back in the 60s and so on, where there were a lot of protest art, a lot of artists making very grotesque and aggressive work, and it got covered over by pop art and minimalism. In that we'd much rather, we wanted the wound of the Second World War to heal, and then there were the artists who thought we needed to constantly pick at the scab, and those are the ones who we, to a certain degree, chose to forget. Much happier celebrating the critique built into Warhol.
Yeah, and you can go back to the Degenerate Art Show. I mean, that was another kind of moment, a moment like this, and also the clamping down. And I guess that's also one thing that I was thinking about, in this show, is we're at this time of kind of flux, chaos, breaking down of boundaries. At the same time, this attempt to kind of enforce boundaries, that seems to get ever more powerful when the boundaries begin to be ever more breached. So that's, I think, part of our contemporary kind of sense of chaos.
Right. And what the reaction to that always tends to be is conservatism.
And what about
we have
to talk about this piece.
I think the conservatism is the dark side to the instability. It is like it's the enforced stability, and I think that pushes us into a different place of psychological territory. Right now, the chaos and the flux we're describing feels like the moment of negotiations, all happening around us. How the chips will fall, I guess history will eventually write itself. Thanks for having this Elliot Arkin on screen right here. Grotesque and humorous. I mean, Charlie Finch eating Mary Boone, and it's a cookie jar. So, you can put tasty treats inside, pull the head off, and enjoy. That is very funny. And, it's not the kind of object that like an R. Crumb drawing, gets a lot of celebration in the fine art world. To that end,
it's blasting, I mean, especially at the time when it was made. I mean, look, it's sort of blasting the art establishment. Charlie Finch as this kind of agent of chaos. I mean, he looks like, what is it, Saturn eating his children,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
And so it's this kind of very funny commentary on, a very a kind of overwhelming art, I guess, art world, art establishment, and this, kind of effort to, I guess, destroy it.
But going back to what you said earlier, Charlie, about curating and the positioning of the works, I think that's also speaks to the idea of hysteria, that individually these works, you look at them, you examine them, you meditate on them, but when you put them all in chorus with each other, they kind of goad each other on, and there's this sort of fever pitch, which makes the show really fun, because it is quite daring. Like, a lot of museums would say this is too much for the viewer to look at. You can sort of count the pieces in the show that are kind of moments, oasis of calm. Maybe the Lasnik picture, but still the theme is quite creepy and dark. But the other works tend to just, you kind of blink and you have to look around, and it's kind of inescapable and claustrophobic. And that is the idea of hysteria, right? That it's not just one voice, but then someone mishears it and then takes the idea and takes it in another direction. And everyone just gets increasingly more and more run ragged by whatever it is, misinformation or fear or all of these things. So the show really does have that, which is one artist kind of makes another artist. So this Charlie Finch eating Mary Boone is kind of grotesque, and then you look at Joyce's picture of a giant Mickey Mouse, and then you're looking at someone with no eyes, and then you see an R. Crumb picture of someone sweating with lots of hairs on their nose. And it really is kind of, it is hysterical and overwhelming. And I think that is a distinct part of how the works work with each other, is that they support each other in their mutual grievances and freakouts, and it is really disturbing to
But let us remember, this is a commercial enterprise.
They kind of exist in this large carnival world together. And it kind of made me think, well, if we are living in this carnival world of chaos and satire, how comfortable can we be with that? How comfortable can we be that we are, constantly being exposed to this moment of absurdity? And then how much then is that hysteria misdiagnosed, as we have known historically, by rules that keep enforcing conservative approaches?
Yeah, it just feels like it's a constant tension, especially now, between those two different forces. Yeah, the order and the chaos, and the effort to impose order because it's so uncomfortable not to have it.
And how much fear comes along with that discomfort when there's not a certainty as to what will happen next. That's the driver, in my opinion, of dogma and conservative decision making.
Yeah.
There's a thing called reinforcement theory, in which, we go to see these shows, we watch any TV program, we watch the debates, so on and so forth. And what it does is we tend to seek to reinforce what we already believe, rather than have our minds changed.
Well, that's why the fact that these works are open-ended actually is very good. Yeah, you're not quite sure where they're coming from. Yeah.
Well, that even is more appealing to the notion of somebody who's seeking reinforcement.
Well,
as opposed to having a very straightforward point of view saying this is it.
Well, and you don't even, unless you come to the show, as all of us did, knowledgeable about these artists in the first place, a viewer who's not coming with that knowledge is not going to find wall labels. They're not going to find excess information anywhere, which is one of my favorite things about Rob's show, despite it being commercial. It's really what it enables for the viewer to just walk in and be amidst this incredible cacophony of work and objects. And there's not one explanation anywhere for what anything means or when it was made or who's the creator. And if you want those kind of facts, they're available, but they're not present in a way that, you know, makes them seem like they're necessary to have the experience that Rob is offering up. And do anyone care to disagree with that?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Well, I want to leave one more moment for any of the four of you to share a thought before we open to Q&A and bring our audience into the conversation.
Throw us to the lions.
I thought that, yeah, the New York Post catalog was great.
Yeah.
Just the idea of this kind of rag that you know, will put anything and then somehow weaves it together with a really silly headline, you know, is sort of brilliant. I think it works very well.
Great. Well, in that case, Eleanor, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. And thank you so much, Saul and Amanda and Eleanor and Will, for that really lively, wonderful conversation. There's so much to dig in with this show, and I'm so glad we got to hear from all of you. And we do have a good amount of questions from the audience today. So I will give the audience a chance to chime in now. And our first question today will be from Inez. And I will give you a chance to unmute.
Okay, this is great conversation. I'm loving it. Anyway, so the artworks, as we've said, seems to the dissolution of the human figure is, I think, response to the way we are being bombarded, our concepts of what it means to be human. Everybody has, are we an individual? I as an individual has a different concept as everybody else, and technology is just bombarding us with everybody else's ideas. And so the idea of truth, where's truth? Is there really any truth? So anyway, my question is, we haven't really talked about the future. Like a few people have mentioned living longer, we're living longer, but what are we living for? What are our grandchildren living towards? I mean, I live in New York. I'm lucky I have clean water. There's plastic everywhere. So if I can live to be 105, what's the world going to be like then? So I think, so anyway, does anybody see anything about the future in these paintings?
Is there a future? Well, I think, I mean, I would say a lot of the work does have a kind of dystopian feel. And of course, dystopia is sort of the idea that, or apocalyptic, you know, that the end is nigh. Yeah, I mean, I think it's not, it's not a show that's meant to point our way towards a hopeful future. And yet maybe just in the fact of its being and of people, you know, kind of bringing these things forward, you know, that telling us things we need to deal with. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, it's it's true. It doesn't feel like a show that tells us that, you know, it's going to be all right.
I think that there's something that we didn't quite touch upon, but I'm going to bring up now is maybe a cousin of hysteria and also a heightened emotion of ecstasy. And perhaps maybe some of that heightened emotion could go in that direction, which actually lifts the spirit rather than pulling it down to the ground.
Mm. Yeah.
And I would also like to add that this exhibition is actually based on an exhibition from 2001 to 2002 called, I think it was called Eye Infection at the Stedelijk. So as much as this exhibition has roots in the history, I think it's fair to imagine that it will lay down roots for further, I want to say, blossoming in the future. And I really take heart in what Saul and Eleanor both said about the 60s and the cycle and what's been happening. And I think what Saul said is really sticking with me, which is that all these things are happening all the time. And what shifts is our awareness. And that, yeah, I don't know that I can paraphrase any better.
Next question.
Just a simple question, no problem. Thank you so much for that question, Inez. It was great, and thanks for your responses, everyone. Our next question today will be from GE. GE, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, everyone. Can we say that the show here is showing us how to learn to wield uncertainty with time and attention, that we can maybe recapture realms of thinking, realms of being so often sidelined by this age of push button thought, and that maybe we can see the human mind in this way at its peak of powers in various predicaments?
I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thought. And maybe that goes back to the, kind of ecstasy, the idea of ecstasy, and that, that sort of things we've lost, and that maybe can be recovered. And that, as I was saying, I mean, I feel like, there's a lot of taboos that get crossed here. And part of the point of the show maybe is also about that. That if we break those taboos, that maybe something new can come out of that. So that's possible. Yeah.
Thank you.
Not sure if anyone else would like to chime in.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if the show's optimistic or not, or if it's that optimistic. As I said, I tend to see it as an index, as Eleanor's pointed out, it tends to be fairly open-ended in that sense. To a certain degree, it might be a display of how much worse things could get.
Yeah, we haven't hit bottom yet. Huh?
If we don't do something about ourselves.
I was thinking too about Amanda bringing ecstasy into the conversation, and I was trying to imagine the opposite of a retinal hysteria, and all I could think of was something like a physical complacency. And I'm really thankful that that's not the cycle that we're in, although it is a cycle that is occurring. I really also like thinking about what Amanda was saying in terms of ecstasy with regard to what GE was saying, because I feel like in moments of ecstasy, there's a myopic or a myopia that kind of comes into place, perhaps necessarily so. And I wonder if people think that's also true of the hysterical moment, if that moment seems activated in any of the artworks. Amanda, I'll pass it back to you on that one.
Thanks, Charlie. I think that the question of it being myopic is great, because it relates back to what we were talking about, the absence of the gaze or the eyes in a lot of the works. And, bodily speaking, I think both those states of hysteria and ecstasy, the eyes kind of do go absent. They turn up, or they just, the being that is inside that body goes somewhere else. Whereas ecstasy, I feel, is more of an out-of-body experience. And I think that the hysteria, you really stay grounded within. It's kind of you're in this state of even more cabin fever. You can't get out. And so what is the question that we're we're talking about here in relation to ecstasy? I mean, I think that I think we see moments of that in the show. and how there is this kind of, if we're talking about the experience of what the works do to us, and what we're seeing is that, yes, we are in this chaos of hysteria, but we could ask ourselves, well, could that heightened emotion perhaps take a turn? Could it be more towards the comfort that I think ecstasy kind of goes in that direction. It goes in that direction of strength and courage and lifting up and pleasure. Is there pleasure in these works that we see here associated with the retinal hysteria?
I think it has a lot to do with what we define as do the works make us feel well or pleasurable, or do they make us feel pain? And I think it kind of falls down into this like drug question of like, there are some drugs that make you very panicky and frantic, and people enjoy that. And then there are some that make you feel very very relaxed. This is not a relaxing show. But then I think that's the question that Rob Storr is asking is like, does it always have to be, like this kind of floating off into oblivion sensation that you might get by looking at like a Monet haystack versus looking at something where there are 1,000 different colors flickering and you don't feel calm. So I think that was, and that's it's interesting about ecstasy. Like, is ecstasy a calm feeling? I think it usually is. But then what's the opposite? What is the sense of hysteria, and can hysteria feel good? And I don't know. I mean, that's the sort of question I ask, because in the, especially in the first, I can't remember which space it was, but the first gallery you go into with all the different bright, shaking, kind of multifaceted images, you are kind of in a state of sort of excitement and agitation. And do you enjoy that? And I guess the answer is yes, but then you have to begin to parse what those different kinds of pleasure are and whether you enjoy that or not, which is the next question.
And I just wanted to maybe add that I think I was visualizing ecstasy more like a trance, towards kind of transcendence, which lightens the spirit and the body. And maybe that towards that kind of a pleasure, that release that Rob Storr was talking about in his text.
But I think there's also a pleasure in destruction. I mean, that's what I think is happening a lot here as well, the taking apart of things. And I don't know, it's just the cycles of destruction and creation in a way. You break it apart so that maybe something new can happen. But I mean, because I think the show is very pleasurable, even though as we're sort of debating whether it's optimistic or not. But no, there's a pleasure in that. I guess, and people saying things, breaking apart taboos, breaking things down, breaking down orders that have gotten to be overly restrictive. So there's a pleasure in that, I think.
Thank you all for those answers, and thank you, Chi. Our next question will be from Babs, and I will give you a chance to unmute.
Hi, everyone. Great conversation. Thank you so much. My question is going to go back to the discussion of speed and art. And I was wondering if you could speak to the influence of social media and speed as it relates to the current artworks versus the art made before the invention of social media. And in my thinking, I also immediately think of social media, and I think of chaos, and I do think of speed, and everything that is happening today is on this fast pace. So I was wondering if you could address that. And also one other note, I love the idea that Rob Storr has no labels, so you're coming into it almost like a social media feed. So anyway, that's my question.
Thank you, Babs. I really like the comparison to the images all over with no information as a kind of physical analogy to what it's like being in the midst of a social media thread. And I think one of the dystopian things about social media also is that, at least in my limited experience with it, you never get to the end. Like there is no, and to that matter, you just begin where you begin without a pretense of what came before. So yes, there's a sense of speed, but there's also this destabilizing sense of presence or non-presence, and your relationship to this flow, I guess. The thing that I felt, I should say that I didn't have I didn't have a sense when I was there that any of the works were directly relating to social media or making any, and if anybody else did, I'd be super curious to hear. I think that the choice to have no information and to more or less enforce the curious visitor to ask it, to seek it out, is also a little bit anti-social media insofar that it requires you to speak words to another human. Like you have to talk to the desk attendants a little in order to learn. That to me engenders a little bit of humanity and a quality of slowness that social media doesn't make a lot of time for, or perhaps doesn't put a premium on. Those are my thoughts on your question. Happy to hear others.
Yeah, I thought that actually it was very anti-algorithmic, or maybe just Rob Storr's algorithm doesn't match the algorithms of social media. I mean, because you get all of these different genres and things happening, it wasn't like there were necessarily obvious links between some works with others. They kind of had this they shared certain aspects, but it wasn't like the kind of thing on social media where you click on one image and then you see something that's directly related to that and directly related to that, which is really boring, and you can't escape from this little cube that you know Instagram puts you into. This was the opposite of that, because you know you would see artists paired up with each other who, you know, sometimes have relations, but other times are very, very, very far apart from each other, and that was actually that was great. That made it kind of disorienting, which is sort of the opposite of, you know, social media. We can get disoriented because we're just looking at pictures over and over again, but there's very often they're almost the same thing over and over again. This was very, very different, which was not algorithmic in a way.
Obviously, you and I have very different practices or ways of approaching this, because on those few occasions where I have to do research, and have to go from image to image to text to page to page, I often find myself a long way from where my original concern was, and it not being repetitive, but you know, once again, back in the days when hyperlinks and hypertext were where you could end up any place. And that's sort of like, so in that way, I found the second show, the one with predominantly drawing, very much like being on the internet. I can bounce from here to there, to there, to there, to there, so on and so forth.
But I think the question also, which I'm still mulling over, is do we see a difference in the works themselves over time? You know, the earlier works and the recent works, do they reflect a different mentality now that we are all, you know, completely permeated by social media and, you know, that we live in a digital world? And I would say one of the things that's interesting about the show is, again, with no labels, if you didn't know the artist, I don't think that you could date the works. I mean, I think that they seem to reflect, I mean, they could, you know, the older works could have been done now, the more recent works could have been done earlier. So in a way, that one of the things that's very interesting about the show is that in terms of, does it reflect a mentality that, you know, we've, you know, now absorbed from living, you know, online so much? And I don't really think so. I mean, the kinds of fluidity, you know, mingling, mutations, you know, all of that stuff clearly was happening in the earlier works as well. So it's an interesting question, but I don't really feel a difference between the older and the recent works.
Possibly the information in the more recent works is denser. I'd have to go back and look, but the earlier works, or older artists like Nutt or
Paschke
tend to be much more discreet and iconic, where a lot of the artists I know in the show who started in the 80s and 90s, the information in their work tends to be dense.
Maybe. I mean, it'd be interesting to go back and think of it in that way.
Yeah. Look at Rob's catalog after this. But I was going to say, in terms of velocity and so on, the notion of speed takes us once again all the way back to the accelerations of the mid 1800s and so on, in which locomotives were considered disruptive. The train travel was considered disruptive because all of a sudden you could be 200 miles from home in a couple of hours rather than in a couple of days. And all of a sudden the information was speeding up because, thanks to the telegraph, news was much more immediate. So the whole notion is, at least since the Industrial Revolution, our society has been accelerating, and we've seen that, especially in terms of the early 20th century, futurism, cubism, so on and so forth. We're all seen as a consequence of acceleration.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Abs, and thanks for those answers, everyone. Really thoughtful. And we did get some other questions from the audience, so thank you. But unfortunately, we don't have time to get to everyone today. So thank you so much if you sent in a question. But for now, our final question of our Q&A will be from Fong. And Fong, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you for everyone tuning into this fascinating discussion on an exciting show, for sure. I'm sorry I didn't listen to the whole entirety of it. I will later, caught up in meeting. But to Barbara's point, her question, we're going through a very interesting time because we didn't have anyone who countered Trump's deployment of speed through Twitter. I mean, in the old days of television, Nixon had JFK. And for sure, during the radio days, whether Hitler was so good at it and so was Mussolini, we have Churchill and then FDR to counter him. So that's where we are at. And if you're interested, you can certainly read the great book by our late friend, the French philosopher Perle Fine. It's called Speed and Politics. It spelled out all the things that you are interested in the moment. But I love the show. All the reason that you've been talking right through it. One thing that strikes me the most at the moment, I came away thinking of the show as a perfect moment where the tragic and the comic collide, which is essentially go further back to Robert admiration for Baudelaire. He works at night. As you know, he was a city dweller. You probably remember the great poem, 1 o'clock in the morning poem, where he walked around the city, at night in Parisian street and tiny little alley somewhere. But he did say to the tail end, I used to remember the entire poem, but until end he say, souls of those I have loved, souls of those I have sung, strengthen me, fortify me, rid me of the lies and corrupting vapors of the world, and you, my Lord, grant me a few good verses which prove to me that I'm not the lowest of man, that I'm not inferior to those I despise. And I think that's where we are at, thinking in terms of tragic and comic, because Putin, to me, with weighty in his heart, lead in his mind, he's so heavy, he's so invested in control everything, you know, the fostering of resoluteness, of pride, of unquestionable loyalty, blind obedience of any kind. To me, that is so part of his idea of, militant aggression. And I think the miscalculation against Ukraine, that when he called the special military operation and claiming that it will be 2 weeks, that miscalculation is really rested on the effort of the likeness of President Zelensky, who was comedian. He only became the president 5 months before the outbreak of COVID. So that agility, that ability to adapt so fast, so quickly against that heaviness of Putin aggression is, to me, that's exactly why the show have that component to it that I enjoy, and I remember Robert's show at Santa Fe 2014. You all remember it. It's also have that continuity. It's called Disparity and Deformation. It's all dedicated to the grotesque. And so that, to me, that's why the show have a resonance of what we're going through at the moment. And it's a pleasure. It's a true joy. So the opening was so insanely crowded. I ran into all our artist friends, Apricot, Judith Bernstein. I ran into, of course, Peter Soul, Sally Soul. I mean, it's just a joy of the community coming together. And that's where we are, The mixture of the grotesque and the tragic is agreeable to the spirit, as all discourse to the jaded ears. That's where we are. And we're not jaded ear, nor we have jaded eyes. So I applaud this, congratulate Robert on this, and I thank all of you for coming, joining to talk further of all the things that we need to talk about, what lie between the grotesque and the tragic. So thank you so much. And it's not a question, but I'm delighted to be able to voice my comments and can't wait to come back when nobody's there, which is tomorrow. So thank you so much. Back to you, Eleanor.
Thank you so much, Vong. And thanks so much again to Saul and Amanda and Eleanor and Charlie and Will for a wonderful conversation. And yes, please do go see the show at Venus over Manhattan. We do have a tradition here at the Rail of concluding our events with a poetry reading, and today I am so thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the day, Samuel Breslin, to the stage. Poet and carpenter Samuel Breslin is the author of 2 self-published chapbooks, Parts of the Passion and Poems about Poland for Americans. He is co-founder and curator of Lightfield, an experimental film festival held annually in San Francisco, and recently received an MFA from the Milton Avery Graduate School of the Arts at Bard College. He's now living in Queens, New York, and working currently on an untitled book-length manuscript of fiction, selections of which can be found at Tagwork, and we're going to link to that in the chat. Samuel, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Eleanor. Thanks for doing a great job hosting. Thanks to everybody in that talk. That was really nice to be able to listen to. I'm still at work and took a lunch break, and like many of you all. I wrote a new piece I got asked to read several days ago, and really was important to try to write something new because I'll read another old piece too, but I want to try to write something new, and it has a sort of dedication built into it. There's some loudness in this space. If it gets too loud, let me know and I'll try to move somewhere quieter. All right. Here we go. A white Buddhist general contractor once yelled at me because I didn't use all the concrete I had mixed to fill a hole. Later, after our friend took his own life, he said, "We are all connected like pumpkins on a vine," which, because I was already crying when he said it, and because he is old, I believed him at the time. But then, later on, what the hell? I do not consent to being all connected like pumpkins on a vine. Except maybe partly. So excuse me now for thinking of you all as pumpkins, but this part I do believe to be true. But what then is the vine? What are the pathways of connection, and in what ways are those pathways unidirectional, and in what ways are they forever flowing? An all-over embroidery pattern, not down gravitationally like the current rips from the snow-melting top of the mountain, trickle stream river, turns into a roaring current that flows to the ocean. No, not that. I deeply do not consent to being humanistically connected pumpkins on a one-way flow vine. I mean it. I really mean it. Because who then is on high in the snow-packed mountain peaks, and who are in the flat plains dipping ladles into the slow flow river valley, waiting for the dam to cut off what waters at all to the people and other living things below? I want our connectedness to be omnidirectional, sympathetic vibrations, and I know you do too. I know that publicly you'd say you do too, as I am publicly saying now to all you pumpkins out there. Pause the poem. Okay, press play on the poem. Here are the first two things that came to my mind when I thought about reading poetry to a lunchtime Zoom lecture series while Palestinian people are being systematically corralled and exterminated. Number one, the single frame of a movie about a teenage girl who for a circus act is learning to ride horses off a platform into a small pool of water many meters below. And two, an Israeli joke that my middle school Hebrew teacher told the class in English in order to somehow illustrate the difficulties of translation, whose punchline was, "Hey, you people up there, stop throwing horses off the cliff." Two thought memories of horses falling from the sky combined are my internal vine system communicating a yet to be translated shame to my mind plot the poem. Press play on the dedication. There are some words that I have claimed not to completely understand their existence meaning in the functional world of people interacting with each other. The first is forgiveness, which I know is something I have done and felt the thoroughness of, but do not know the mechanisms for how it occurs. The other is dedication. I mean, our dedications. When dedicating things to people who will never know, they are having poems dedicated to them. I could like to dedicate this reading to my Jewish great-grandparents who escaped the unidirectional violence of Eastern Europe, only to have a nation-state created in their name, in the name of their safety, that enacts the same type of violence enacted upon them, upon other people with darker skin than they. I could like to dedicate this reading to my Filipino grandparents who escaped the omnidirectional violence of the South Pacific to eagerly assimilate to capitalist utopian Northern California, only to later gamble away some supposed fortune. And doing that would give you a sense of the epigenetic pumpkin spice that brews within me, shame style, extra foam, nausea, bubble up. But they are no longer with us. And I don't know if the connection vine spans the living dead divide. So I'm not going to dedicate this poem to any of my ancestors because since this is not the poem, this is the dedication, I don't want it to be a metaphor. I want it to be actual. Turn up the volume on the dedication. I want to dedicate this poem to all you people out there connected like pumpkins on a vine. who feel shame and guilt like I do. And I would like to invite you as an internal task that if you are up for it, you may begin at any time to try and divide those two related feelings such that they can be attended to appropriately and effectively with compassion and clarity. For example, I feel shame that religious and racial-based violence is being committed in the name of my cultural background. And I am going to think about the ways in which I am implicitly connected, yet refuse to be complicit. And related but separate, I feel guilt that I haven't done enough of my part as a private citizen to try and effect change. So I will continue to call my elected representatives and show up for protests and resistances when I can, calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. Slowly turn down the volume on the dedication. Feel the quietness. Sorry. Feel the quietness grow around you as a kind of peace. Think about if you feel like we might be all connected like pumpkins on a vine, and decide what you want to do about it. That was a little unexpected. Excuse me. All right. I want to read I'm going to change directions a little bit. I think I can. This is the first page of my book, which I different from the introduction. I actually finished it. So, yeah, I want to read from it. And then I have one more short piece after this. This is pretty short too. I have too many glasses. I have too many pairs of glasses because of the clarity that I seek. I once had clarity with one pair, but I lost them, and so got another and saw clearly again. But then I wanted a different look, so I got another, because what good is clarity through a pair of glasses when the world looking back at me gets an unclear vision of who I am because I have glasses that don't look quite right. Through this pair, I both saw clearly and felt clearly seen as the attractive glasses-wearing person I felt myself to be. Then I started getting headaches while driving and looked at things in the distance, wondering if I saw clearly, questioning if the thing itself were clearly seeable, especially lit signage on storefronts whose edges always seemed blurred. And then one day I could not see clearly a cactus in my own house, and I thought, well, some cactuses cannot see clearly. This cactus is clearly out of focus. But objects in the world cannot be out of focus. Non-screen things are always in focus. You are projecting your own inability to see clearly onto the things around you, blaming the goddamn cactus for being out of focus. Through certain old windows, the world warps and becomes unclear. Smog softens the edges of buildings downtown, and the cruise ship emergency docked off the port is so large that it makes my head shake a bit, and I have to turn away, because 3,000 people on one boat is tough to imagine clearly. Where are they all? I can't picture them spread through the entire ship, speckled into rooms and in bathing suits, on lounge chairs, and lined up holding plates for the buffet. I can only picture them all together, near the top deck pool, facing me, and looking up for a portrait. Yes, this I can see very clearly. And I'm gonna read one last quick thing, and I'm going also to post this one in the chat in case you want. Whoops. In case you want to use it, take it and use it for yourself. It's called Script for Calling Your Elected Representatives to Demand an Immediate and Permanent Ceasefire in Gaza. Oops, my message is too long. Try sending it in multiple shorter messages. I'll do that after this. Hi, my name is insert your name, and I'm a constituent of my elected representative. I live in Ridgewood, Queens, zip code 11385. I'm calling to urge your office to call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza and refuse to send additional weapons or funding to the Israeli military. I will not vote for elected representative in the next election, and I will mobilize other voters in my community to do the same if you continue to be complicit in the war crimes and unnecessary killing of innocent Palestinian civilians. International human rights organizations and governments across the world are clear that the actions of the Israeli army are disproportionate to the threat they are under, making the now 18,000 deaths, including 7,000 children, not only unnecessary, tragic, and immoral, but illegal according to international law. This is a time to be bold, and you will be remembered for the brave choice you make to stand for the safety and human rights of people in danger. Thank you very much. Free Palestine.
Thank you so much, Samuel. Last one was a great one. They were all amazing. Thank you. And thank you so much again to Will and Eleanor and Amanda and Saul and Charlie for this great conversation. And thank you so much to Andrea and Anna and Zachary from Venus Over Manhattan for supporting the preparations for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making our daily conversations possible, and for supporting our archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. We are also fundraising this season to help keep the Rail free. We're fundraising $200,000 to directly support our writers, guest artists, production staff, and operations for the coming year. As a small nonprofit, the Rail does need your support, so please consider donating at the link in the chat to help us meet our goal. And join us tomorrow at a special time of 6 p.m. Eastern time. So it's going to be an evening, maybe a dinner NSE, for a conversation with Candace Lynn and Andrew Woolbright on the event of Lithium Sex Demons in the Factory at Canal Projects. And tomorrow we will have a reading to conclude by Larissa Pham. And thanks so much everyone for tuning in today, and you can turn on your microphones, and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much, everyone.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Samuel.
Thanks,
Amazing
Bye-bye.
poems. Thank you,
Thank
Samuel.
you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Fun.
Conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Samuel.